individuals possessed shares on the stock market. Just 2% of the country. It grows significantly up to a peak of about 11% in 1990. So here we have the Conservative Party now not just saying to people, okay, you can buy own your own homes or live in your own home, which was the great appeal, remember, of conservatism in the 50s. You can be part of this new world of goods. Now they're saying, look, you can be part of capitalism itself. You can play this game as well as anybody else. By 2006, only 14% of individuals were shareholders. Okay, so still just about 14%. In contrast, 40% of stocks were owned by foreign investors in Britain in 2006. Okay, this is a dramatic U-turn. In 1963, only 7% of British stocks were owned by foreign companies. So what you have in the 80s and 90s is a huge influx of foreign capital into the stock market. Remember, basically, that the financial industries in Britain had basically been used to spreading their capital around the world. That was one of the ways in which Britain supposedly became great. Now we have the reverse of that, journey. Very similar thing is true in terms of property owning. The other great promise of privatization was to make everybody an owner-occupier. Okay, so the privatization of council houses so that people could have their own, own their own council houses begins in 1979. It's hugely popular in the first 2 years. There's a bit of a slump, grows again in the boom of the late 1990s, and then tails off. In a way, the more important figures are these ones. Okay? In 1971, 52% were owner-occupiers. 52% of Britain owned their own homes. You can see that basically that's more or less the same in 1981. By 2001, i.e., after the end of Conservative government, is the peak of home ownership in Britain at 72.5%. And then we all know what's happened since 2001. Lots of people, I shouldn't be laughing, lots of people have lost their houses, and we're now back to the levels of owner-occupiers that we were in the 1970s. So there really is no substantive difference here between the policies of the Conservative and the Labour parties. Okay, the Labour Party did not return any of those old, those privatised industries back into public ownership. All it basically did when it came to power in 1997 was create new types of regulatory bodies for the public utilities, primarily on grounds of health and safety. Okay, so it provided a new type of government oversight to the private monopolies that now ran the old public utilities, but it did not return them into public ownership. And it accelerated the trends of owner occupation through a variety of tax reforms that I don't have time to go into. Let's talk about the deregulation of the labour market. Now, the key way in which any project of economic liberalisation works is by making sure that the labour market is as flexible as possible. Therefore, it has to be stripped of its regulatory features. Because what you're after, basically, is to try and provide forms of labour that are unmobilised in terms of union power and able to be deployed in increasingly casual and cheap forms. At the heart of this this process in Britain was a staggering amount of unemployment. Remember that basically the project of social democracy had been to deliver full employment. And we saw how, unusually, in the 1970s, unemployment began to climb up to levels of about 1 million or 1.5 million. But it was still seen to be politically completely unacceptable that unemployment had reached that level. During the 1980s, unemployment reached peaked to over 3 million in 1983. It was actually higher than it had been in the economic crisis of the late 1920s and early 1930s, if you factor in the way in which they calculated unemployment rates. It dipped briefly back to 2 million, i.e. still significant, almost double what it had been in the 70s, climbed back up to 3 million in the mid-90s, and then under New Labour was brought down substantially but again, down to the heights that were thought to be politically unacceptable in the end of the 1970s. In other words, an unemployment rate of about 1.5 million had become almost normal by the 21st century. The other key part of the deregulation, so unemployment works then because basically everybody is grateful to have a job. Okay? You can produce reforms to the labour market when you have this type of scale of unemployment. Another key feature of this was, of course, the reform of the trade union movement. In 1980 and 1982, there are two key employment acts. The 1982 Act is by far the most important because it outlaws the closed shop. That is where you can only join a firm if you're a member of a union. It required a ballot for the election of officials and for strike action and for the use of public funds, because in the old days, basically, it was ballots were conducted by a show of hands, like the unreformed electorate. It was very easy for, they used to bundle everyone into a soccer field and say, all right, who's out for a strike? And obviously there was no way of judging those sort of 60-40 splits. Most significantly, what happens is that the miners go on strike in 1984, and they go in strike basically without holding a ballot and a postal ballot. And they go on strike without holding a ballot over the reform of the mining industry. They were bringing in a new American CEO who was going to restructure the mining industry, and Arthur Scargill, the leader of the NUM, takes the miners out on strike. They're out basically for the best part of a year, over a year actually, and they're soundly defeated. It's a hugely damaging and catastrophic strike for the NUM. Remember, the NUM had basically brought down the Heath administration in the early 1970s, and Thatcher was determined to put them back in their place, and she soundly did. The defeat of the miners in 1984 was basically the end of the road for mass trade union membership. You can see very quickly the levels of trade union membership begin to plummet. By 1998, they're less than half of what they had been in 1979, and the NUM, the most powerful arguably of any trade union, had ended up with just 20,000 members in 1994, and of course in part that is because Arthur Scargill was dead right and the mining industry was basically wiped away by the reforms after the miners' strike. The other part of the deregulation of the labour market was the increasingly punitive approach to unemployment. Okay? We're not talking about a return to the poor laws and to the incarceration of the poor into workhouses, but we are talking about a return of a view of unemployment as increasingly the fault of individuals, not of the economic system. And so a variety of forms were made to unemployment and welfare benefits that tried to ensure that it was impossible to be a so-called welfare scrounger. And I'm going to play you a very quick clip of one of my favourite comedy programs that stages this treatment of the unemployed in a... No, it's not going to work because I'm on a different computer, isn't it? Damn. Okay, sorry, you're going to have more of me instead, and you know you're delighted. Taxation. I'll see if I can get it on the other one at the end of the class. So we all know by now, I'm assuming, that a central part of neoliberal economics was to reduce the tax burden on the population as a way of ensuring that the size of the state was challenged, because obviously the state depends upon the revenue that comes from taxation. And we all know as well, I think, that by now that one of the consequences of this policy over the last 30 years has been an increasing gap or an increase in forms of income inequality, which I'll come on to in a moment. In Britain, there was, Mrs. Thatcher began straight away to reform the tax system. And in three fundamental ways. One, she reduces the basic rate of tax from 33% to 25%. Okay? But in order to attract the wealth creators, she, and that was in quotation mark, she reduces the top rate tax from 83% to 40%. The reason why people like Elton John live in the US is not just because Britons were very glad to get rid of him, but because he was one of many tax exiles. Many of the super rich fled to the US from the UK in the 1970s because of the top rate of tax being very high. And of course, probably most importantly, the reduction of the corporate rate of tax from in half, basically, from 52% to 27%. Okay? So there's a general policy there in which the smallest reduction, I hope you'll note, is to the basic rate of tax. Okay? But nonetheless, everybody participates in some type of tax benefit, even if it is that corporations and those who are the wealthiest get the biggest slice of the cake. The other rejigging of the tax system was the shift to indirect forms of tax. Okay? The introduction of sales tax, which in Britain is called VAT, value added tax. Okay, now this is obviously a strategy that hits the poor far more than it hits the rich, because everybody has to pay VAT on the goods that they buy, and of course, the lower down the income chain you have, the greater the percentage of your income it becomes. New Labour basically tries to outdo Thatcher. Okay, so here you think